Good morning and welcome everybody. I know we're all having a great conversation. Hello, I'm Luna Orsoletto. I am the City Club President-elect. Erica was unable to make it today. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people in the room today. We're getting back to our pre-pandemic attendance. I really want to welcome our new members and our longtime members, community members, and friends today. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank our sponsors for today: ASI Wealth Management, the City of Bend, Central Oregon Community College, OSU Cascades, St. Charles, Pacific Source, Central Oregon Association of Realtors, Brooks Resources, and there's more. Advocate Contracting, Bend Park and Rec, First Interstate Bank, FM Civic, Kittleson and Associates, Miller Lumber, Morgan Stanley, Stephen Hacker, and the Lucille Center. Thank you very much. We so appreciate your sponsorship. We wouldn't be able to make this affordable if we didn't have sponsors. So City Club is all about having meaningful conversations, especially today. It's going to be such a very, very personal conversation about firearms. So it reminds me of a quote from Anais Nin. It says, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." I'm going to repeat that. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So this may speak to all of you a little bit differently, but the quote to me means we all have various perspectives from our own life's experiences. So today's discussion, you may not agree with everything the panelists say today, but we're just going to ask that you be respectful of others' perspectives, ideas, and take a look at the tools of civility that we have on the table. So, and also after the discussion that we have with our three panelists today, we are going to do something a little bit differently. We are going to have a 10-minute table discussion. With the table host, please raise your hands. Thank you. They're all volunteers today, and they're going to guide you through one question that we are going to ask of the panelists, and we're going to have the table host ask the question to our speakers. So thank you very much for that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Zach DeMars with City Club. He is a familiar face here at City Club. So Zach, welcome to the stage.
Hi everybody. Always great to be back at City Club and so excited for today's conversation. Before we get into our panel and our questions for our panel today, we wanted to start with questions for all of you. So on your tables, there is a QR code that has a Menti poll. It's 2 quick questions, and it's going to help us set the table for our conversation today. We're going to ask you if there are guns in your household and what gun safety means to you. And this is going to help us kick off with our panelists. So we'll give everybody just a minute to go ahead and answer those poll questions, and then we will have our panelists come on up. If you haven't yet, go ahead and keep responding, and we will, I'll introduce our panelists here today, but go ahead and take your time with those responses and we'll dive into them. So today on our panel, we have Michelle Barnhart. She's an associate professor of marketing at Oregon State University, and her research focuses on cultural norms, social groups, identity, and consumer well-being as produced in and challenged by consumption. Her current research investigates firearm consumption and policy. Next, we have Shannon Monahan, who is the CEO at Red Frog Team and the executive director of Downtown Bend. She has a passion for entrepreneurship, business development, marketing, and branding. Her career has included traveling the globe, navigating international manufacturing, national sales rollouts, and multiple brand startups. And after visiting Bend throughout her life, she's happy to be living and working in a community that she loves. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Tori McGowan. She is an emergency medical physician at St. Charles Medical Group. She completed her emergency medicine residency with the U.S. Air Force and then served 12 years active duty military and is a combat veteran with deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She's currently a lieutenant colonel in the Oregon Air National Guard. So we're going to take a look here at the responses that you all shared to our second question in a moment. But maybe before we do that, we will ask the same question to our panelists. So to each of you, what does gun safety mean to you individually? And you want to start?
Sure.
Great.
Sure, I will start. So I take a pretty broad view of gun safety. So I think of it as any and all efforts to reduce the risk of gun injury or death. And that would include efforts at the individual level, at the community level, like things like this, where we're trying to raise awareness of gun safety, or at the state or federal level in terms of regulation. And also broadly in terms of what do I mean by gun injury and death? Well, literally anything. So suicide, homicide, accidents, negligence, any form of injury or death by gunshot.
Excuse me, my voice is a little hoarse, but gun safety to me is specific to training. My relationship with guns and firearms is in the training realm. So gun safety to me is very specific, actually, a little bit different. I'm very concerned about how a person who may be in the presence of a firearm behaves with that firearm. It's my concern that they're educated on the firearm, whether it's a safe firearm or not, and how that relationship is. Like an instrument that you need to be proficient at in the musical world, a firearm is an instrument that you need to be very proficient at. And formal training is what I think of when I think of gun safety.
It was on. Sorry, I can't figure out the microphone. For me, gun safety focuses very much on the appropriate access to firearms for someone that has the appropriate training and knowledge to handle that weapon safely in that time period. And that changes at different times in our lives. Just like we don't think about cars as something that everyone should be driving all the time, we think about there are appropriate times for you to get behind the wheel and there are appropriate times for you to hand those keys to somebody else. And so I like to think of firearm safety very much in that same way of how do we make sure you have the training, the knowledge, and the appropriate access at the right time.
So one of the big things we want to talk about today is the practice of talking about guns and gun safety, which is a little bit of a meta conversation, but I think it's an important one before we can even start having that conversation. So, Michelle, I think everybody's experienced some sort of challenge in having a civil conversation around guns, gun rights, gun regulations, that sort of things. Why is that? Why is it so hard to talk about?
Well, so conversations about guns get really personal really fast. And I think that's even more so for guns than it is for consumer products that you might think of as fairly personal, like clothes. And I think there's three key reasons for that. First off, over the last 30 years, gun ownership and attitudes about gun control versus gun rights have become more aligned with political affiliation and political identity than they were, say, 50 years ago. And in the last 10 years or so, it's become hyperpolarized like a lot of political issues. And so bringing up the topic risks getting into a uncomfortable political argument, so people are hesitant to do it. Secondly, I think on the topic of gun safety in particular, it's challenging because safety is so related to responsibility, and responsibility is very tied to morality. Doing the responsible thing is doing the morally right thing. And the gun owners that I've talked to in my research all really want to be responsible gun owners. I shouldn't say all, there's a few, but the vast majority really want to be responsible gun owners, and they want to be seen as responsible gun owners. And the challenge comes that we all kind of have different ideas about what is responsible behavior. So if you bring up the topic of gun safety and responsibility, there's a chance that you may have a very different idea about what that means than the person you're talking to, and then it quickly kind of feels like you're questioning their morality, or they're questioning your morality and sense of responsibility. So that can get really uncomfortable. And then the last thing I'll say is that discussions of gun safety really can't avoid the topic of gun suicide, as gun suicides are the largest percentage of gun deaths. And nobody wants to think that somebody in their household or themselves may want to take their life at some point. So that's a really challenging topic to bring up.
And Tori, you have these conversations with patients in, hospitals are a very intimate place to be having conversations with people. So how do you approach those conversations? And do you think they're, challenging for providers to have sometimes?
These are really challenging conversations to have with patients, and honestly, I have conversations with people about all kinds of crazy things, and so that helps me be able to have those conversations, because I talk with patients about not just how they store their firearms, but I talk with them about sexual practices. I talk with them about, what did your parents die of? Those types of conversations, and learning how to have those, has made this a little bit easier. The timing of those conversations in the emergency room is a really interesting thing, because most people would think, oh, you talk to those, if somebody comes in with a gunshot wound, that's when you talk about it. For me, that conversation needed to happen before. If you're with me with a gunshot wound, I've already missed that opportunity. And so being open to having those conversations before, when there is a moment to intervene before you end up in my emergency room as a gunshot wound patient, that's where we have to have that. And so I look for those opportunities with patients. Whenever I have a kid that got into a bottle of medicine that they weren't supposed to, and they're there for an overdose, I talk to parents and I say, we need to talk about how you safely store all of the things in your house that can be dangerous. That's medications, that's chemicals, that's firearms. My husband, I told him he was going to get picked on a little bit here today. But when we had our kids, for a very long time, my husband just put the pistol up in the closet. And I said, you know what? There's actually some research about this. If you have your pistol in your closet and you think your kids don't know where it is, you are wrong. Yeah. And the statistics say that 70% of kids know where it is and they can get to it. And most children that are injured with a firearm accidentally, it's because they were showing it off to a buddy. So because of that, my husband got told, this is how we're going to do this. We are going to get a gun safe, and still be able to access that. So those are those types of conversations that I like to pull in. And again, to echo Michelle's conversation, this is a hard conversation that I have with patients when they come into the emergency room in crisis. And again, I frame it like, you shouldn't be behind the wheel if you've had a couple of beers. You shouldn't have your firearms if you're in a mental health crisis. If you are thinking about harming yourself, that is a perfect time to ask somebody that you trust to store that firearm for you until that crisis has passed. Not that we're taking it away forever, but right now, it's not a safe thing for you to have. And how do we be able to have that conversation in a way that feels safe for them?
Shannon, I want to kind of dig into this idea too of how do you have conversations with your loved ones about their safety with guns and that sort of thing? How do you have those kind of conversations? How do you approach those?
Well, honestly, starting this company came out of fear as a mother. And the conversation, I raised my children out in the country in a log house and property and a lot of guns around, and I was terrified. And so I really wanted to become more educated myself. But as I dove into the world of tactical training and educating people, there's two different markets here about the way you talk to people. There's the male market and the female market. And I see this room, there's a lot of lovely women here, and we approach that conversation differently. In the male market, men will go out and buy guns, they'll shoot 1,000, or they'll get the gun, pull it out of the box, get out in the woods, shoot 1,000 rounds down range, having never taken a single formal training class. a woman will be handed a gun by her husband or uncle or a law enforcement neighbor, and she'll look at that gun safely in the box for 2 or 3 years before she'll touch it, because she wants the information first, to know before she goes and approaches it. And so these conversations are different based on male or female. And I think one thing I'm trying to do is help concierge what is a complicated subject to women, making it palpable so it's demystified. I think the way we approach these subjects is different for children as it is for a male, as it is for a female. And now knowing that the market has grown so significantly in the last 2 or 3 years, the threat landscape has changed in the country. And women have felt the need to, more and more, buy firearms for defense. So we have to kind of really be creative and make palpable and concierge these different target markets into that conversation. So.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point that, Michelle, you were talking about earlier, just at our table, about the changes in the market for firearms, because that's precisely what you study. So can you talk a little bit about how that market has changed in recent years, and maybe why, if you know why?
Sure, yeah. So, when I was a kid, if you went to a gun show, it was all like hunting rifles and shotguns. Just to give you a little sense, when I was a kid was the late 70s, early 80s. And now you go to a gun show and it is predominantly pistols and modern sporting rifles or assault-style rifles, depending upon which group you're in. They call them different things. And so it's changed, and hunting rifles are kind of hard to find. So the landscape has changed dramatically in terms of the types of weapons that are being sold. Right now, it's predominantly pistols and guns for self-defense. In surveys, those who are buying guns now, I think 80% now are saying that they are buying them for self-protection. Interest in hunting has gone way down in the last 30, 40 years. So it's really shifted towards self-defense. And then, the regulations have also changed so that, now you can get a concealed carry license, and in 21 states, I believe now, you can carry without a license. They have permitless carry. So the places where guns are, the types of guns that are being purchased, the practices that consumers have with their guns have really changed dramatically in the last 30 years.
And I guess question for any of you, how do those changes change safety? How do those changes impact the way that we think about and are safe with guns in our communities? Shannon?
Well, it's increased the opportunity for those firearms to get in the hands of people who are not educated. So what I tell people, and politically, I don't care, whether you like them or not, whatever, all I care about is that a person, someone very scared of a firearm, as I used to be, is capable of identifying a safe or unsafe firearm. So we can't teach our children to go into another person's home, or as a mother who's just dropping her child off for a sleepover, if I don't understand what is safe and unsafe practices for storage and safety, how am I going to identify that? So even if I can't stand guns, I'm scared of guns, I tremble at the thought of guns, I need to be educated. So I come from a perspective of I put the politics aside, just if you have to, they're there. Like you said, they're out there. I don't know what's happened, well, I do know what's happened in the last few years, but they're out there, they're there right now. So what can we do about it to prevent it going in the direction that she has to deal with? And so my thought is however you feel about it, become educated on it for the purpose of protection, making it safer.
Can I add something really quickly?
Please, yeah.
So the shift towards handguns has also, just if you kind of think about it practically, in terms of child access or suicide, just physically, it's a lot easier for a little kid to hurt themselves with a handgun than it is with a long arm. And similarly, it's a lot easier to shoot yourself with a handgun than it is with a long arm. So both of those risks have increased with the increase in handguns.
And So for each of you, one of our goals today is to have folks walk away with concrete takeaways, how they can be more safe, how they can make sure their loved ones are more safe. What advice would each of you give to folks who, want to be more safe? What kind of concrete takeaways would you recommend that people focus on when they leave this room today? Tori, do you want to go first?
Sure, I will start with that one. For me, safe storage is one of the most important things that I really think about. When we look at our injury patterns with St. Charles, half of our injuries from firearms that we see are accidental. So how do you handle a weapon safely and how do you store it safely? My son is 13 and he shoots with the 4-H club and has, I think we started when they were 5 or 6, but my kids have been shooting most of their life. And he asked me, when do I get the code to the gun safe? And I said, never. When you move out and you get your own gun safe, that seems like a really appropriate time. But I don't see any reason for him to have that without having an adult around. I also know that right now he's a pretty happy 13-year-old, but at some point stresses of life may get to him. We know that just the presence of a gun in the home increases the risk of successful suicide by 67%, if I remember correctly. It's a huge number. And controlling that access is really important to me.
Will you say that number one more time? Because I haven't heard that one before, and I just want to let that sit for a minute.
You're going to get me in trouble if I've got the statistics slightly wrong. But just the present, so when we look at suicides, let me expound on that just a little bit more, because that, the news, I'm going to blame this on the news, we really sensationalize mass shootings, right? That's what we think about. When we talk about gun control, man, we want to ban those assault rifles because of what happened in Safeway. That is such a small number of firearm injuries and deaths that it doesn't even hardly show up on graphs when we look at this like the nerds do. When we look at what is killing people with guns, and he's had that nice slide up there, 78% is suicide. So if we can make a small impact on that suicide number, that makes a huge difference. Here in rural areas in Central Oregon, we have a much higher suicide rate than in urban areas. And that's because in rural areas, people are much more likely to attempt with a firearm than with another means. 85% of the time, if you try to kill yourself with a firearm, you are successful. 85%. And the other 15, if you attempt with a firearm and you are unsuccessful, that is lifelong disability and injury. Now, if you take too many pills, I call up Dr. Harris and he gets to put you in the ICU for a couple of days, but you usually survive that one. And we get a chance to intervene and try to help with that crisis that got you there. One of the things, again, that is so important to me to control what we call access to lethal means. The average time, does anybody know the average time between when you decide to kill yourself and when you actually do it? How many people think it's a day? You make that plan, man, you're going shopping, you're going to go to the gun store? 5 hours? 5 minutes. 5 minutes between when most people decide to kill themselves and the actual act. Now, my husband still can't get in the gun safe without my help because he forgets the code. Actually, we have two. One he can remember, one he can't remember. But if that 5 minutes, if he has to figure out what the gun safe code is, 10% of people will change their mind if there is a single step interrupting that, what we call the chain of lethal means. So if your gun is unloaded rather than loaded, 10% of people will change their mind. If your ammunition is stored in a separate room or a separate place, 10% of people will change their mind. And again, that's where I would have a really hard time, I guess, maybe having that conversation with somebody who couldn't say, you know what, that actually is as a firearm owner, as a gun owner, if you tell me that just making it a little bit harder for somebody to get that gun that lives in my household and I could save their life, because if they're going to try to kill themselves with a gun, they're probably going to be successful. If we can't have that conversation together, we can't have any of these together. Sorry, I went off on a tangent.
I think it was a very good tangent. Sorry that we're still picking on you, though, Tim. So, Shannon, what about you? What concrete steps or concrete actions do you hope people take away from today's conversation?
Again, being very specific to tactical firearms, which is my realm. A Glock 43X is a common pistol, an AR, a long-range gun, but specifically an AR and or a pistol handgun. When you leave the store with a handgun, buy a holster. I think a holster is a happy, safe place that protects your finger from the trigger well. When it's not stored in a safe, go buy a toaster oven safe, a simple hand safe if you have a handgun. Handguns scare me more than any other firearm, of putting hundreds of people downrange and safely executing training classes. The most scary moments are always with men with a large hand with a small pistol and a handgun. The muzzle turn on it so quickly, you can get in a lot of trouble with a handgun. The other point that I want everyone to walk away with, I had an opportunity to be in front of someone for about 47 minutes, and I wish I would have said this and burned it into this person's memory. The 4 basic principles of gun handling, whether you like guns or not, whether you want a gun in your house or not, whatever your politics are, never, always treat a gun as if it's loaded. Never point it in a direction of anything you don't intend to destroy or harm or kill. Never put your finger on the trigger or in the trigger well until you're ready to shoot. So long and straight, long and straight, long and straight. And then the last being, know what's your target, what's beyond your target. Because this, the blast isn't, you need to be purposeful if that time ever comes and you have to do that. Someone I was in the presence of, I didn't say that to them, and they ended up killing someone. And that person was Alec Baldwin. And to this day, I'm like, wow, I had 47 minutes. We talked about guns and all sorts of things, but I'm like, that was a very, if nothing else from today, that's buy a safe, get a holster, and the last, formal training. Women get very stressed out getting training from their husband, their uncle. It's like learning how to ski or golf. It just doesn't work with couples. The most dangerous moments on our training range was with couples concealed. The women, so it's very hard. So getting formal training is really important. So again, and it's ongoing. So.
And how about you, Michelle? What kind of concrete steps do you hope people come away with?
Well, I'm really glad that Tori went first, because I was going to make a point about safe storage, and she made it way better than I did. I did have one extra statistic I'll throw in there. So gunshot is the second leading cause of death for children in Oregon, and 62% of those are suicides. So a really high rate of suicide with gun by children. So I'll take one step back, and now that we've talked about the risks and responsibilities of having a gun in your home, just to take a minute to, recognize those and think about, is it worth it? Just like you do with any consumer product, weigh the risks of bringing that consumer product into your home, the effort and the responsibility to make sure that you maintain it and keep it safe, versus the benefit that you're going to get out of it. If you're like my family, and we used to hunt a lot in the 70s, and we have these inherited shotguns and rifles that nobody hunts anymore, so they just kind of sit there. For a long time, they just sat in the corner until finally I got my dad to get a gun safe. It's not really, we're not getting any benefit out of them. They're just there as kind of an additional risk in our household. We would be better off really to gift them to somebody who we know would enjoy hunting and who we know would be responsible and use them safely. Or if you don't have anybody like that, you can take them to a reputable dealer who's going to follow the appropriate regulations and make sure they go to somebody who is authorized to have them. If you already have a gun for self-protection, like a lot of people do now, or you're thinking about getting one, like we said, that's the highest highest percentage reason that people now cite for getting a handgun is, or any gun, is self-protection. If you're thinking about that, ask yourself if your particular risk of being a victim of violent crime is higher than the risks of just bringing that gun into your house. Honestly, if you are, I'm just looking around the room here, if you are a white Oregonian, you probably are increasing your risks by bringing a gun into your house. Violent crime tends to be very concentrated across the country, and here in Oregon, you're like 5.5 times more likely to die from a gun suicide than you are from a gun homicide. So, if you live in a safe neighborhood, maybe just weigh those costs and benefits, and make that decision based on your actual risks that you're taking.
Can I build on that just a little bit? One of the ladies that I speak with about gun safety is a lady named Dr. Megan Ranney. She is actually with the Public Health School, I believe, at Yale now, and is one of the nation's leading researchers on firearm injury prevention. And she and I gave a talk together, talking a little bit about that idea of what is the risk and why would you want to have a firearm? And she lives and has lived her entire life in Boston. And before we actually started collaborating, she'd never fired a gun, she'd never handled one. And we had some real heart-to-hearts and sit-downs of, so how as a physician, when you see these injuries that happen, how can you still own guns? And I said, well, let me tell you about where I live. I live in Jefferson County. We have a population of around 20,000 in a county that's the size of Rhode Island. We have more antelope than we have people. When I call my colleagues in law enforcement, if I were to call them from my house, I'm guessing that probably about the fastest that somebody is going to get there is probably 20 minutes. They come to the ER pretty quickly because we are a problem child. But there aren't very many in Jefferson County, and they cover a huge area. And so what does that look like in the lag time between response and being there? That changes when you've lived your entire life in Boston and you know that help can be there within 5 minutes. It is a different conversation, and I think that, part of the theme of today is being able to talk about how does my life look different than yours, Megan? And having that conversation of explaining why that felt important to me to be able to do that. I shared the story of my dad. So my dad is a dentist from over in the valley. He had a patient. This was several years after he'd retired, so he was in his mid-70s. Had a former patient come up to him and threaten him. The patient was mentally ill. Dad's in a very small town, so he caught him at the post office and said, "You made me lose all of my teeth, and I am going to stomp your face in and kill you." And my dad very dutifully picked up his cell phone, his jitterbug, and dialed 911, and he was told, "Your nearest officer is in Roseburg, which is 30 miles away. You do what you can." And what he did was he got into his vehicle and pulled out and had his pistol available because he has a concealed carry permit. But how scary is that to be accosted by somebody and to be told when we pick up the phone that help is not coming? And to be able to share that with somebody who was staunchly anti-gun, who had spent her entire career studying why people shouldn't have access to that, and to have somebody be able to say, okay, that actually makes a little bit of sense to me. And maybe there's something in this that my perspective, how I see things, like Linda used that great quote, how I see the world is a little bit different from somebody else, and maybe there is value in that other piece. That's how we start to have those conversations today.
Just to touch on that, there's, like you said, there's a gap between between when an incident occurs and when law enforcement can arrive. Not everyone is ready to run out and buy a gun. And one thing I speak to a lot of people, including my family in Atlanta, they had an incident, they have 4 little girls, they're not ready to have guns. So non-lethal approaches. So there's lethal weapons and there's non-lethal weapons. And there are many, situational awareness is a wonderful start. Communications and information, the way you communicate when a threat's going down, and then non-lethal options. I have a business owner downtown who had a concern, and I recommended to her, hornet spray, dog the bounty hunter pepper spray. Like there's a lot of levels to intensity as you're choosing your defense weapon. And so opening up the conversation to just, threat preparedness and not necessarily jumping right into guns. Guns is a tool in your tool belt, but there's a lot of other tools, self-defense, jiu-jitsu, women's, things like that. But situational awareness, I'd start with that. So, yeah.
Great. Well, there's a lot to chew on there. And fortunately, now we have some time to do that. We're going to jump into our table discussion. So each table has a lovely table moderator who's going to lead you in a little conversation with each other about some of the topics that we've talked about. And in about 10, 15 minutes, we'll come back here, and hopefully every table will have developed a question, and we'll be able to pose those questions to our audience. One note about the questions that you develop: I'm sure there are plenty of burning questions about specific policies, specific regulations, specific ballot measures that might be held up by the Oregon Supreme Court right now. And I will note some of those questions are great, but we don't have lawyers or some of those public policy experts on the panel. So think about that when you're crafting your question. We might not have the best answers on some of those hyper-specific policies. So I will leave it to our table moderators now to lead us in our conversation. Alrighty, folks, it is time for our Q&A. So we've got Kim Gammond has a microphone, and she is going to be coming to each of our tables and asking a question. If we can bring it back.
Test. All right, Bill, table 1.
I'm Bill Buchanan, City Club member, and our question at this table was, political entrenchment is an obstacle to progress on firearms safety. Are there areas where progress can be made that are bipartisan?
Anybody want to take it away?
Well, so I can just give you some statistics. So polling data would indicate that across both Republicans and Democrats, there's huge support for universal background checks. So hopefully we could make some movement on that to prevent guns from getting into hands that they shouldn't be in. The other area where I do think there's a lot of agreement, and I can see this, I've done research with gun violence prevention groups and also with gun organizations, and everybody wants to try to prevent suicide. So if we can find some common ground, some common language to talk about trying to do things to prevent suicide, I think we can get some movement on that.
Other thoughts?
I will just add one thought, because so many of these conversations, first of all, the loudest voice, the most extreme voices are always the loudest in conversations. And so the people that want to listen to both sides often get drowned out. And there's also this, we're either going to do it all or we're going to do nothing thought process that happens a lot in politics. We're going to make the big sweeping change of a generation, or it's not worth it. There are so many small places that we can make a 2% or a 5% improvement, and every percentage point is a life. And so we have to stop doing this false dichotomy of we're going to fix it all or it's not worth trying. We have to look at those smaller solutions that make things a little bit safer along and along.
When the Newtown incident happened, and then Orlando, and then Vegas, it was about the time I started Red Frog, and the company was actually started for threat assessments for campuses, schools, and hotels. And it started out of a reaction to my frustration watching the news going straight into the gun conversation versus giving people strategies for threat prevention. And to go from being a soft target to a hard target, all this airtime on the news for about 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, when incident kept happening and happening, it went straight to the politics of the guns. And I'm like, I'm a mom at a Bible study. or a school or a campus going to, whatever. Safeway. Give me some tactic, give me some answers or strategies, lethal or not. Just give me information. And all the airtime is used for politics with no solutions. And so that was the initiation of Red Frog, was for threat assessments.
Hi. So, we have a deputy fire chief at our table who's been in the fire department that's fire and rescue, for 24 years. She has never had a call from someone who was shot by an intruder in their home. Not one in 24 years. So one of the issues that we had with the way that this conversation unfolded was this implicit assumption that there's more risk than ever to us all. We think this is actually a pretty safe place to be. But there are a lot of guns out there, and so our question is, at the community level, what more can we do so that you're not having a conversation after somebody comes into the emergency room?
I'll take one of those, one piece of that. I agree that when you look statistically, we are the safest that we have ever been as human beings. We're actually doing really well. If you ever come into me and as a patient and you're having a heart attack, I will explain to you that really statistically, as an older person, you're probably going to die of heart disease or cancer because we've done everything else pretty well. We have good, safe cars, and we wear seat belts. So statistically, something's going to get you eventually. But figuring out how to have those, how to make those small areas safer is absolutely important. For me, St. Charles actually has a new program that is handing out gun locks. We've talked a ton about safe storage. Just putting a gun lock onto that, if a safe is not an option for you, safe storage with a gun lock is another great way to do that. So that's one thing that St. Charles is sponsoring in the community, and Dr. Harris is a big part of that, that you will start to see in our areas. It's not political, it's not partisan, it's if you have them, let's talk about storing them safely.
I would just add to that, normalizing the conversation so it doesn't get so extreme that people are afraid to ask about their get information or education. I find a lot of women feel vulnerable and they grab me and quietly whisper, "Can you give me some training?" because they're uncomfortable bringing to light the fact that they have guns in the home. And so normalizing and access to formal good training. I think the environment for women, knowing all these women have firearms in their homes, but not really, a non-intimidating concierge to get more information. The gun store is a very intimidating place for a woman. She walks up to the counter and you feel dumb the second you open your mouth. It's just not a welcoming place for information. So for me, I keep coming back to women because I spent so much time making accessible training for men that during COVID, I'm like, the soft target, if there is a soft target in the situation that's unsafe, it's usually a female, oftentimes a female, and they're the ones that have the hardest time getting this kind of training. So just normalizing and calming the conversation. The guns are out there, unfortunately, at high levels, and I feel like the training, the education is not, matching that level.
So I'll just add, am I on? Okay. As a marketing professor, I tend to think about things from a business level or an organizational level. And I don't know if we have any gun dealers in the room. You do not have to raise your hand if you are. But I would love to see more gun dealers upselling by when somebody buys a gun, say, and do you have a gun safe? And do you have a trigger lock? As a business person, I don't know why you wouldn't, right? Ask them to buy something else. So getting gun dealers to kind of push the safe storage more, I think could help some. And then if you're a member of any kind of organization that interacts with gun owners, so for instance, the Oregon Association of Shooting Ranges right now is working with the Oregon Coalition for Firearms Safety to really have the conversation about potential suicide amongst their members. So just bringing up those topics and getting people to talk to each other and feeling a little more comfortable about broaching the subject of, I know you're going through a hard time right now, Zach. Do you want me to hold your guns for you for a while? And they have training that teaches you to do it better than I just did, So, if you're a member of an organization where you can have kind of more of an organizational effort, try to think of those things.
Okay, we have, can I make a, Kent Vanderkamp is from Deschutes County Sheriff's Department, and he brought up a good thought for people to keep in mind, that it's called a valet service, so it's not the police taking your guns from you, but there are times when if somebody wants to check in their gun, that they're happy to do that, and that's a service for everybody to keep in mind, that there's no judgment on that. And then our question is, do you have some tips on ways that we could recognize when someone is in that trough of despair, and when and how you would actually bring up that conversation about having them put their guns away or take them away?
I'm looking at Tori.
Everybody's looking at me. The short answer is that's a really hard answer. And we know that when we look at suicide prevention and suicide intervention, sometimes if people are absolutely committed to that, they will often show no signs. And so I like to call that out because as a military commander, one of my military members committed suicide and spent a lot of time soul searching about how did I not see that in this person. And I don't know about you guys, but in the military, there's a lot of suicide intervention training, and you're supposed to look for these signs, and you're supposed to do this and intervene. And I took that very personally as a commander about how did I miss that, and as an ER doc, shouldn't I have seen that? I think one of the ways that we do that is we start to normalize these conversations every single day, so that instead of waiting until somebody has had a chance to go through crisis and get so far down that pathway that we can't get there, that we can't have that conversation, or that they don't feel like there's an ability to connect and to talk about that, we need to check in and we need to have these conversations on a regular basis. I don't know if there's any Ted Lasso fans in the audience, but season 3 just launched last night. And I absolutely love that program, partly because of the work that it is doing that is normalizing Ted. During some of his matches, he has panic attacks. And what other TV show have we watched where we've watched somebody have a mental health crisis and then be able to talk about that and have that conversation and say, wow, I'm really struggling. And instead of waiting till you're in the emergency department at the moment of crisis to figure out how do we intervene further down. Some of the things that we see as risk factors and that we know that we need to watch people on more: job losses, relationship failures, relationships ending, so death of a loved one. Another thing that we always think about is increased alcohol or drug use. So if you are starting to see that in people, those are people that are showing you signs of crisis. If that's the first time you have a chance to intervene with them, next time look for it earlier. But those are still important times to just, and honestly, the way that I like to have those conversations when I'm not your doctor, when I'm just your friend, is, wow, it's been a lot lately. How is that for you? I don't know about the rest of you, but with COVID, I will tell you straight up, COVID has been, and the last few years have been, a ton to deal with in the emergency room and in medicine. And I will gladly admit that I have a counselor that I see who gives me a tune-up about every 6 weeks, because it's incredible. What we ask our people to bear is a ton. And just being able to have that conversation and to be able to say, yeah, I ask for help, and that we normalize that conversation is really important, so that we don't have to wait until somebody's absolutely in crisis and they end up in my emergency room, unfortunately, with an injury.
And I think we have time for about one more question, which I'm so sorry for all of the great questions that we won't get to, but go ahead.
Hi, Don Palmier, Table 14, and we appreciate you guys walking us through this difficult topic, and for City Club for hosting it. Our table talked a lot about how it's really a zero-sum game, having this discussion, and people are so polarized, so we welcome ideas you have on initiating that discussion with your family, your coworkers, with whomever, that kind of de-escalates right from the start, where we can have a legitimate discussion without getting into a fight about it.
I would approach it with, I think one thing we all agree in this room is on safety and our children's safety, starting with something we all agree on, and that's where you start the conversation. I grew up in Portland. I've been in Oregon since 1974, and my friends don't share the same passion for guns that I do. A lot of my girlfriends in Portland, but the one thing we have in common is that education. They want to be educated. They're uncomfortable, but they have a child and they have a family, and there's dynamics that we can't all control, and it's not political. It's just, I think you start with what we all agree on, which is we want our family and our children to be safe, with the fact that there are guns out there. So if you start I feel like you start from a place of safety, because everyone can agree on that. So this is the perfect forum.
Well, and I'm going to pull Tori back into the conversation, because when we were sitting at the table here, I think you had a great approach to bringing up safety with your fellow moms when kids are coming to your house. Would you like to share with the broader group?
So one of the things that I was sharing is, the more we have these conversations, the less awkward they are and the better we get at them. Again, I am perfectly comfortable asking you about what you ate and everything very personal about all of the parts of your body. But I wasn't always. I got better at that the more conversations I had. And so we get better at this the more that we do. And what I was sharing at the table is, when I have two boys, a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and every time a new person is coming to my house, a new child is coming to my house, when I'm having that text conversation with the mom and setting up that play date, I say, we live on a farm. We have animals. We have tractors. We have ATVs. We have guns. Here is how I keep your child safe from all of those. If they're going to be outside around the horses, I'm not going to let them be around my horses without an adult around. My kids have to wear helmets. My kids have a helmet for every sport on the planet, and they hate it. But, if we are riding, I have enough helmets for everybody. We do have firearms in our home. This is where they are stored, and this is how your child will not have access to them. And the number of moms that have responded really, really positively to that, some of them are just like, oh, okay. And some of them are like, wow, thank you for helping me feel like my child's going to be safe in your home. But we have to normalize those conversations. And never once would because I offer that to people, but I would never be offended if somebody asked me about that. And, the last thing my kids get when they leave the house is, hey, you may when they're going to somebody else's house, they don't have the same rules that we do. Know that you may have a firearm, and what do you do, or that you may find one? What happens when your buddy pulls that out? The answer is you go get an adult, period. You don't touch it, you don't mess with it, you go get an adult.
So I'll add just one more thing that I can't not add because I'm a marketer. You also have to be careful with your word choice. And that always starts with listening first. And we'll come back to the original quote, right? You see the world the way you are, whatever you said that was so profound. You listen to the way other people talk and what is important and valuable to them, and then try to tap into those values. So in rural communities, personal responsibility tends to be words that resonate and that people can understand, right? The value of personal responsibility. So you can talk about gun safety in those terms. You know, you might use slightly different words if you were talking to people in the big city. So listen first, see what's important to them, and then try to tap into those values.
Can I answer just one last, the scripting that I like whenever I get into an awkward conversation? That's different than how I see it. Can we talk about that? Think of the power of those words. Can we talk about that? It's not political, it's not aggressive, but it certainly opens a door to say, that's a perspective I haven't heard.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Let's give a hand to our excellent panelists today, folks. And I will note, as many of you hopefully know, today's forum is a partnership with the Bulletin. The civil informed discourse that you saw today on stage is what we try and exemplify every day in our reporting. So if you're interested in supporting our work, I invite you to subscribe to the Bulletin. There's info on your tables on how to do that. With that, I will hand it back to Kim Gammond.
Thank you to Zach, Michelle, Shannon, and Tori for leading us in conversation today. And thank you to the Bulletin for this partnership that deepens our preparations and our research and our thinking about the topics that we've been discussing. And thank you to Zach. This is his last forum with us before he moves on to law school. And I did get permission to say that. So thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you. So if you have not already, please take a look at this last weekend's articles in the Bulletin. There were two, one that has all our panelists and another one that focuses more on the law enforcement aspects. So, you know, if you're not subscribing, you'll definitely want to do that to read those. And then our next forum is on Thursday, April 20th. It is our Regional City Managers Forum. This will take place at Tethero. So if you're planning on coming, stick your sticky note on the calendar right now that you're taking a left on the Parkway or Century Drive instead of a right, and head to the Tethero Events Pavilion for April 20th for Regional City Managers. And then I'm also excited to announce that we have launched a membership drive. As a nonprofit, we only exist with the support of our members. There's more information on your tables and as you exit, but members that refer new members will be members that refer new members that join will get a free forum pass, and then new members that join will be entered to win a case of Vapiano wine. Thank you to everyone for being here today and your willingness to discuss incredibly difficult topics.